She walked down the aisle in the dress I helped her pick out, marrying the man who had been my husband for 12 years. The entire wedding party celebrated their perfect love story while I watched from my car across the street, holding the DNA test results that would destroy everything they thought they knew about each other. What they didn't realize was that their passionate affair wasn't just adultery, it was something so much darker that would make headlines across Portland and leave both their lives in absolute ruins. The secret I discovered didn't just end their relationship. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It destroyed his career, sent her fleeing the state, and revealed a family conspiracy that had been 25 years in the making. By the time I was finished, everyone would know exactly what kind of people they really were. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I went from being the devoted wife who brought homemade lunches to the office, to the woman who single-handedly orchestrated the most satisfying takedown in Oregon legal history. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in our Hawthorne district home. I was in the kitchen preparing Mike's favorite breakfast, steel-cut oats with fresh berries and a drizzle of local honey from the farmer's market. The October rain drummed against our Victorian home's windows, creating the cozy atmosphere that had drawn us to Portland 15 years ago, when we were still newlyweds dreaming of building something beautiful together. Mike appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his charcoal gray suit, the one that made his green eyes look almost emerald. At 42, he still had the athletic build that had caught my attention during our college years at Oregon State, though recent months had added a certain restlessness to his movements that I couldn't quite place. "You're up early," I commented, stirring the oats while keeping my voice light. Mike had been leaving for work increasingly early, claiming that Northwest Marketing Solutions was going through a busy period. As someone who ran her own marketing consultancy and owned ZenFlow Studio, I understood work pressures, but something about his recent schedule felt different. "Amanda scheduled some early client calls," he replied, reaching for his travel mug. The way he said her name, Amanda Reed, his executive assistant, carried a familiarity that made me pause mid-stir. It wasn't unusual for him to mention work colleagues, but lately Amanda's name seemed to pepper every conversation about his day. I watched him check his phone, noting how his thumb moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. The device had become his constant companion over the past few months, never leaving his side even during our evening yoga sessions in the living room. When we first met, Mike used to tease me about my attachment to technology. Now he slept with his phone on the nightstand, face down but always within arm's reach. "Will you be home for dinner?" I asked, ladling the oats into his favorite ceramic bowl. The question had become routine, though the answer was increasingly predictable. "I'm not sure, this Morrison Industries pitch is consuming everything." Amanda's been staying late to help me prepare the presentation materials. There it was again, Amanda's name, accompanied by a slight softening in his voice that I was only now beginning to recognize. Mike kissed my cheek with the same gentle pressure he'd used for years, but something essential was missing. The warmth that had once made my heart skip still carried affection, but it felt more like the love you'd show a treasured friend rather than the woman you'd chosen to spend your life with. I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comforts of our shared life, and realized I was being slowly erased from my own marriage. After Mike left, I found myself standing at the living room window, watching his BMW disappear down the tree-lined street. Our neighborhood buzzed with the typical morning energy, joggers heading toward Mount Tabor, dog walkers greeting each other with Pacific Northwest politeness, baristas opening the coffee shops that made Hawthorne feel like a small town within the city. The silence in our house felt heavier than usual. Over the past few months, I'd attributed the growing distance between us to natural relationship evolution. 12 years of marriage inevitably brought changes, and Mike's promotion to senior sales director had increased his responsibilities significantly. My own businesses were thriving, ZenFlow Studio had a waiting list for classes, and my marketing consultancy had landed 3 major Portland companies as clients. We were both successful, both busy, both committed to our individual growth. But standing there in the morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. The easy conversations had become polite exchanges of information. Our weekend adventures exploring Oregon's coast and mountains had been replaced by Mike's weekend work sessions. Even our physical intimacy had taken on a perfunctory quality that left me feeling more lonely after than I had before. I decided to surprise him with lunch at the office. Northwest Marketing Solutions occupied 2 floors of a renovated warehouse in the Pearl District, and I'd always enjoyed visiting Mike's workplace. The exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures created an atmosphere of creative energy that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with Portland's business community. The elevator opened onto the familiar buzz of the sales floor. Representatives worked their phones with the kind of enthusiasm that made Northwest one of the region's most successful marketing firms. I'd consulted for enough companies to recognize genuine workplace energy versus forced corporate culture, and Northwest had always felt authentic in its collaborative spirit. Mrs. Coleman, the receptionist's greeting carried genuine warmth. Mike didn't mention you were stopping by today. I wanted to surprise him with lunch from that new place on Burnside, I replied, holding up the bag from Farm Spirit, knowing it contained Mike's favorite seasonal grain bowl. He's in the conference room with Amanda, working on the Morrison presentation. I think they've been in there since 8 this morning. The receptionist's expression remained professionally pleasant, but something in her tone made me pause. Was there a slight hesitation before she mentioned Amanda's name? I made my way toward the conference room, my footsteps muffled by the modern carpeting. The Pearl District office had floor-to-ceiling windows that normally made the space feel open and transparent, but the conference room blinds were drawn, creating an unusual privacy that caught my attention. Through the thin gap between the blinds, I could see Mike and Amanda hunched over a laptop, their heads close enough that their hair nearly touched. Amanda Reed was 28, with the kind of effortless beauty that seemed particularly suited to Portland's.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Casual elegance. Her auburn hair caught the conference room lighting, and her laugh, which I could hear through the glass, had a musical quality that probably made clients feel instantly comfortable. But what struck me wasn't their proximity or her attractiveness. It was the way Mike looked at her when she spoke, with a focused attention that I realized I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. His entire body was angled toward her, creating an intimate bubble that excluded the rest of the world. I knocked softly on the glass door, watching as they sprang apart with movements that seemed more guilty than professional. Mike's face lit up with surprise that quickly shifted to something that looked almost like annoyance. "Jess, I wasn't expecting you." He stood quickly, straightening his tie in a gesture I recognized as his nervous habit. "I brought lunch from Farm Spirit," I said, stepping into the room and extending the bag toward him. "I thought you might be hungry after your early morning." Amanda remained seated, her fingers still poised over the laptop keyboard. Up close, she was even more striking than I'd realized, with the kind of natural grace that made expensive clothes look effortless. Her smile was perfectly professional, but her eyes held a knowledge that made me feel like an intruder in a space where I'd always been welcome. "That's so thoughtful," Amanda said, her voice carrying just the right note of appreciation. "Mike was just telling me how lucky he is to have such a caring wife." The comment should have felt complimentary, but something in her delivery made it sound almost patronizing. I found myself studying her face, searching for clues about what exactly I was sensing. She was beautiful, obviously intelligent, and apparently devoted to helping Mike succeed. On the surface, she seemed like the ideal assistant any executive would want. "We should probably get back to the presentation," Mike said, already opening the takeout container. "The Morrison deadline is pretty tight," I nodded, understanding the dismissal, but feeling strangely reluctant to leave. Something about the dynamic in that room felt significant, though I couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering me. Amanda's attention had already returned to the laptop screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard with efficient precision. "I'll see you at home," I said, leaning in to kiss Mike's cheek. His skin felt warm, and I caught a hint of unfamiliar perfume that definitely wasn't mine. Walking back through the office, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Several employees looked up as I passed, their expressions carrying a sympathy that confused me. The receptionist's smile seemed forced when she waved goodbye. Had everyone noticed something about Mike and Amanda that I'd been too trusting to see? The drive back to Hawthorne took me through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the yoga studio, where I taught evening classes, and the coffee shops where Mike and I used to spend Sunday mornings reading newspapers and planning our week. Portland had always felt like a city that supported authentic relationships and genuine connection. The irony that my own marriage might be dissolving while I helped others find balance and peace wasn't lost on me. That evening, Mike arrived home later than usual, carrying the scent of rain and something else I couldn't identify. Dinner conversation felt stilted, punctuated by the constant buzzing of his phone with what he claimed were work messages. Each notification seemed to pull his attention further away from our dining room table, until I felt like I was eating alone despite sitting across from him. "How was the presentation prep?" I asked, trying to inject genuine interest into my voice. "Good, Amanda's really detail-oriented. She caught several issues I would have missed." His praise for his assistant carried an enthusiasm that our conversation about my own work had lacked for months. Later, as we prepared for bed, I watched Mike in the bathroom mirror while he brushed his teeth. The familiar ritual of our nighttime routine felt like a performance we were both going through without real engagement. When had we stopped really seeing each other? When had our conversations become exchanges of logistics rather than genuine connection? I slipped into bed beside him, noting how he immediately reached for his phone to check one final time for messages. The blue light illuminated his face as he scrolled through what appeared to be work emails, but his slight smile suggested the content was more personal than professional. "Important client issue?" I asked softly. "Just tomorrow's schedule," he replied, setting the phone face down on his nightstand. But even in the darkness, I could see the device's screen lighting up with new notifications every few minutes. As Mike's breathing deepened into sleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our bedroom. The house settled around us with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that had once felt comforting but now seemed to echo the growing distance in our relationship. Something was happening to my marriage, something that went beyond the normal evolution of long-term partnership. The rational part of my mind insisted I was overreacting. Mike was under pressure at work, and I was probably projecting my own insecurities onto innocent professional relationships. But another part of me, the intuitive voice I'd learned to trust through years of running businesses and reading people, insisted that something significant was shifting in our lives. I thought about Amanda Reed, trying to pinpoint exactly what had bothered me about our brief interaction. She'd been perfectly polite, professionally appropriate, and genuinely helpful to Mike's work. But there had been something in her eyes when she looked at me, a knowledge or confidence that suggested she understood our family dynamics better than a new employee should. The next morning brought the same routine, but I found myself paying closer attention to the details I'd previously accepted without question. Mike's phone buzzed with a text at 6:15, 15 minutes before his usual alarm. He reached for it immediately, suggesting he'd been awake and waiting. His thumb moved across the screen quickly, typing what appeared to be a response before deleting it and starting again. "Early client call," I asked from my side of the bed. "Amanda wanted to confirm the timing for the Morrison meeting," he replied, but his voice carried a defensive edge that made me wonder why such a simple scheduling question required immediate response. Over breakfast, I mentioned that my friend Sarah Kim had invited us to a dinner party the following weekend. Mike's immediate response was that he'd probably need to work, specifically mentioning that Amanda had suggested they use weekend time to prepare for upcoming presentations. "She's very dedicated," I observed, noting how Mike's face softened when discussing his assistant's work ethic. "The best assistant I've ever had," he agreed. "I don't know how I managed before she joined the team." Amanda Reed had been working at Northwest Marketing Solutions for exactly 4 months. In that time, she'd apparently become indispensable to Mike's professional success and increasingly central to his daily routine. The timeline coincided almost perfectly with when I'd first noticed changes in our marriage, though I'd attributed those shifts to other factors. After Mike left for work, I found myself walking through our house with fresh eyes. The framed photos that documented our relationship told the story of two people who'd been genuinely happy together. Our wedding pictures from the Oregon coast showed faces bright with joy and anticipation. Vacation shots from various adventures captured moments of authentic connection and shared laughter. But the most recent photos, from Mike's company holiday party just 3 months ago, told a different story. In those images, Mike's smile looked practiced rather than genuine, and his arm around my waist seemed more like a pose than an expression of affection. I realized that I couldn't remember the last time we'd taken a photo together that captured real joy, rather than obligatory documentation. The discovery I made that afternoon changed everything, though at the time it seemed like a mundane household task. While organizing Mike's home office to make space for some new marketing materials for my consultancy, I found a manila folder tucked behind his filing cabinet. The folder contained documents that initially appeared to be routine business paperwork, but closer inspection revealed something that made my blood run cold. Among the papers was a copy of Amanda Reed's employment application, complete with personal information that employees typically wouldn't share with colleagues. Her emergency contact was listed as Carol Reed, followed by an address in Salem, Oregon. But what caught my attention was a handwritten note in Mike's writing in the margin. Check connection to Thomas Coleman. Salem address matches. Thomas Coleman was Mike's father. Mike's father, who had left his mother when Mike was 15, moving to Salem and starting what Mike had always described as a new life that didn't include his original family. Mike rarely spoke about his father, and when he did, it was with the kind of resigned sadness that suggested old wounds had never properly healed. The handwritten note implied that Mike had suspected some connection between Amanda and his father, though the nature of that connection wasn't clear from the documents. But if Amanda Reed was somehow connected to Thomas Coleman, and if she was now working closely with Mike while maintaining that connection secret, the implications were staggering. I sat in Mike's office chair, holding the employment application and feeling like I was looking at the first piece of a puzzle that was much larger and more complex than I'd imagined. The woman who had been spending increasingly intimate time with my husband, who had been helping him prepare presentations and staying late at the office, who had been the recipient of his focused attention and growing emotional investment, might be connected to his family in ways that would make their relationship not just inappropriate but potentially devastating. The rational part of my mind insisted I was jumping to conclusions. There could be innocent explanations for the note, coincidental connections that meant nothing. But my intuition, sharpened by years of reading people and situations in business contexts, told me I was looking at evidence of something much more significant than a workplace affair. I photographed the documents with my phone, ensuring I captured both the official information and Mike's handwritten note. Whatever was happening between Mike and Amanda Reed, I was going to understand it completely before deciding how to respond. The woman who had built 2 successful businesses and navigated complex professional relationships was about to apply those same analytical skills to saving her marriage. But as I returned the folder to its hiding place, I realized that salvation might not be the appropriate goal. If my growing suspicions were correct, I might be dealing with something that would require a completely different kind of response, something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about my husband, his family, and the woman who was systematically destroying our life together. The first real confirmation came 3 days later, during what should have been a routine trip to Blue Star Coffee Roasters. I developed a habit of stopping there after my morning yoga classes, partly because their Ethiopian single origin matched my preference for bright, complex flavors, and partly because the large windows provided an excellent view of the Pearl District streets, where Northwest Marketing Solutions conducted much of its business entertaining. I was reviewing client proposals on my laptop when I spotted Mike's BMW pulling into the parking structure across the street. Nothing unusual about that, since several restaurants in the area served as popular meeting spots for business lunches. But when Mike emerged from the driver's side, he wasn't alone. Amanda Reed stepped out of the passenger seat, smoothing her burgundy dress with movements that suggested she was preparing for something more significant than a routine work meeting. What caught my attention wasn't their presence together, but the way they moved as a unit. Mike's hand settled naturally on the small of Amanda's back as they approached the entrance to Undina, one of Portland's most intimate and expensive restaurants. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it carried the casual familiarity of people who had touched each other many times before. When Amanda laughed at something Mike whispered near her ear, her entire body angled toward him, with the kind of unconscious magnetism that suggested deep emotional connection. I watched them disappear into the restaurant, my untouched coffee growing cold as I processed what I'd witnessed. Mike had left our house that morning, claiming he had back-to-back client meetings all day. He'd specifically mentioned lunch with the Morrison Industries team, describing it as a crucial presentation that would determine whether Northwest secured their largest contract of the year. But Morrison Industries was a manufacturing company based in Eugene, hardly the type of organization that would conduct business meetings at an upscale Peruvian restaurant, known more for romantic ambiance than corporate entertainment. The realization that Mike was lying to me about his whereabouts felt like discovering a crack in the foundation of our house. Not devastating in itself, but indicative of structural problems that could bring down everything we'd built together. I found myself studying the restaurant's entrance, wondering how long they would stay, and what kind of conversation required such an intimate setting. My phone buzzed with a text from Mike sent 20 minutes earlier. Morrison lunch running long, don't wait up for dinner if I'm late. The timestamp showed he'd sent the message at exactly the moment I'd watched him help Amanda out of his car. The casual efficiency of his deception was almost more disturbing than the lie itself. This wasn't a desperate man making impulsive choices, this was someone who had developed systematic methods for hiding his activities. I remained at Blue Star for another hour, ostensibly working on marketing strategies for my clients, but actually watching the flow of business people entering and leaving the surrounding restaurants. Portland's downtown lunch scene operated according to predictable patterns that I'd observed during years of meeting my own clients in the area. Most business lunches lasted between 60 and 90 minutes, with parties emerging looking either satisfied with successful negotiations or displaying the careful neutrality that indicated ongoing discussions. When Mike and Amanda finally appeared on the sidewalk, their body language told a story that had nothing to do with professional success. Mike's arm was draped casually around Amanda's shoulders, and she was looking up at him with the kind of adoring expression typically reserved for romantic partners rather than workplace colleagues. They stood outside the restaurant for several minutes, their conversation animated and intimate, before Mike leaned down to kiss Amanda's forehead in a gesture so tender that I felt physically ill watching it. The betrayal wasn't just that Mike was having an affair. The betrayal was that he was having the kind of affair that involved genuine emotional connection, the kind that transforms people and changes the entire trajectory of their lives. This wasn't a casual indiscretion or a moment of weakness. This was a man falling in love with someone who wasn't his wife, and doing so with apparent joy and enthusiasm. I drove home through Portland's tree-lined neighborhoods, feeling like I was seeing the city through different eyes. The coffee shops where Mike and I used to spend weekend mornings now looked like potential meeting spots for secret lovers. The restaurants where we'd celebrated anniversaries and promotions now seemed like venues where other people conducted the romantic relationships that we'd apparently stopped nurturing. Even our own Hawthorne district felt different, as if the comfortable familiarity that had once felt like home now highlighted everything that was missing from our marriage. That evening, Mike returned home with the kind of energized mood that I hadn't seen in months. His skin had the slight flush that comes from excitement and attraction, and his movements carried a restless energy that suggested barely contained happiness. When I asked about his day, he launched into an elaborate story about the Morrison Industries meeting, complete with details about presentation challenges and client concerns that he delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had spent considerable time developing his narrative. Amanda really saved the day, he concluded, settling onto our living room couch with the satisfied expression of someone who enjoyed talking about the object of his affection. She'd anticipated most of their questions and had backup materials prepared. I don't know what I'd do without her. The praise for Amanda's professional competence was accompanied by a soft smile that transformed Mike's entire face. This was how he used to look when he talked about me during the early years of our relationship, when my achievements and insights filled him with pride and admiration. Now that expression was reserved for his assistant, while conversations about my work received polite attention at best. Over the following weeks, I began documenting patterns that revealed the true scope of Mike's deception. His early morning departures coincided with text messages that he claimed were from clients, but that made him smile in ways that business communications rarely did. His lunch schedule became increasingly unpredictable, with meetings that he described vaguely and that often lasted far longer than professional appointments typically required. Most telling were the changes in his personal habits. Mike had always been particular about his appearance, but recently he'd upgraded his cologne to something more expensive and sophisticated. His workout routine had intensified, and he'd started paying more attention to his wardrobe, particularly on days when he mentioned working closely with Amanda on important projects. These weren't the changes of a man simply taking better care of himself, these were the changes of a man trying to impress someone specific. The credit card statements provided concrete evidence of what I'd begun to suspect. Charges at high-end restaurants appeared with increasing frequency, always for amounts that suggested two people dining rather than solo business meals. Purchases at jewelry stores, flower shops, and boutique clothing stores created a pattern of someone conducting a courtship with considerable financial investment. Most damning was a charge at Powell's Books for what appeared to be multiple items, followed the same day by a charge at a gift wrapping service. Mike had always claimed to dislike shopping for gifts, often asking me to handle birthday and holiday presents for his family and colleagues. The idea that he was now choosing thoughtful presents for Amanda, taking time to have them professionally wrapped, suggested a level of emotional investment that went far beyond workplace appreciation. I found myself becoming someone I didn't recognize, a woman who checked her husband's phone while he showered, who memorized his schedule to identify discrepancies, who drove past his office building, hoping to catch glimpses of behavior that would confirm her growing suspicions. The transformation from trusting wife to suspicious investigator felt like a betrayal of my own values, but the alternative was continuing to live in willful ignorance, while my marriage disintegrated around me. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Patricia Williams, the CEO of Northwest Marketing Solutions, at a charity fundraiser for Portland's homeless services. Patricia and I had always maintained a friendly relationship, partly because my own marketing consultancy occasionally collaborated with Northwest on larger projects, and partly because she appreciated having spouses who understood the demands of running successful businesses. "How's Mike adjusting to all the changes at work?" Patricia asked during a quiet moment between auction items. The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested she was fishing for information rather than making casual conversation. "Changes," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral, while my heart rate accelerated. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, as if she was realizing that she might have revealed something I wasn't supposed to know. "The new client management structure," she said carefully. "Mike didn't mention that we're restructuring his role to focus more on account retention rather than new business development." This was the first I'd heard of any restructuring, despite Mike's detailed daily reports about his workplace activities. If his role was changing significantly, it was the kind of development that would typically dominate our dinner conversations for weeks. The fact that he hadn't mentioned it suggested that either the changes were minimal, or that he was actively hiding professional developments that might affect his ability to maintain his current schedule flexibility. "So focused on the Morrison Industries contract," I said, probing gently for more information. "I think that project has consumed most of his attention lately." Patricia nodded thoughtfully, but her expression remained guarded. "Morrison is certainly important," she agreed. "Though I have to say, Amanda Reed has been instrumental in managing that relationship. She's shown remarkable initiative for someone so new to our industry." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Patricia's careful phrasing and diplomatic responses confirmed that she was aware of dynamics involving Mike and Amanda that she wasn't comfortable discussing with me directly. Her professional discretion was admirable, but it also suggested that their relationship had become visible enough within the company to warrant careful handling by senior management. Driving home from the fundraiser, I realized that my marriage was dissolving not just privately but publicly. Colleagues were noticing changes in Mike's behavior and his relationship with Amanda. Patricia's careful questioning suggested that the situation had reached a level where the CEO felt obligated to assess whether it might affect company operations or create potential legal complications. The humiliation of discovering that my personal life had become a topic of professional concern was almost worse than the betrayal itself. How many of Mike's colleagues had watched his growing infatuation with Amanda while I remained obliviously supportive of his career success? How many business associates had observed their intimate interactions, while I continued to bring homemade lunches to the office and attend company functions as the devoted wife? That night, I lay in bed listening to Mike's steady breathing and processing the full scope of what was happening to our lives. The man sleeping beside me wasn't just having an affair, he was conducting a complete emotional and professional reorganization that excluded me from decisions about our shared future. He was building a new life with Amanda while maintaining the facade of our marriage, apparently believing that he could manage both relationships indefinitely without consequences. But as I stared at the ceiling of our bedroom, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of 12 years of partnership, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion that had dominated my emotions for weeks began to transform into something harder and more focused. Mike and Amanda thought they were conducting their affair in secret, but they had underestimated both my intelligence and my capacity for strategic thinking. The woman who had built 2 successful businesses by carefully analyzing complex situations and developing comprehensive solutions was about to apply those same skills to understanding exactly what was happening in her marriage. And if what I suspected about Amanda's connection to Mike's family was true, they were both about to discover that their secret relationship was built on a foundation that would destroy them both. The next morning, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Instead of confronting Mike about his lies or demanding explanations for his behavior, I decided to become the kind of investigator who could uncover not just what was happening, but why it was happening, and who was really responsible for destroying our life together. The transformation from victim to strategist began with a simple phone call to Marcus Thompson, a private investigator whose services I'd used occasionally for background checks on potential business partners. Marcus had built his reputation on discretion and thoroughness, qualities that made him popular among Portland's business community for handling sensitive corporate matters. "I need a complete background investigation," I told him during our meeting at a coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District, far from any location where Mike or Amanda might accidentally encounter us. "Personal history, family connections, financial records, everything you can legally access." Marcus listened to my situation with the kind of professional detachment that made it easier to describe the intimate details of my failing marriage. His questions were direct and practical, focused on gathering the information necessary to conduct effective research rather than offering sympathy or relationship advice. "Family background investigations can reveal unexpected connections," he said, making notes in a leather portfolio. "If you suspect there's a relationship between your husband and this woman that goes beyond workplace attraction, we'll find it." I provided Marcus with everything I knew about Amanda Reed, including the employment documents I'd discovered in Mike's office and the handwritten note about Thomas Coleman. The investigation would take several weeks to complete, but Marcus assured me that his findings would provide a comprehensive picture of who Amanda really was and how she'd entered our lives. While Marcus began his research, I focused on documenting Mike's daily activities with scientific precision. I created detailed logs of his departures and arrivals, his claimed meetings versus his actual locations, his mood changes and physical appearances that might indicate intimate encounters with Amanda. The process was emotionally exhausting, but it also provided a sense of control that had been missing from my life for months. The evidence accumulated steadily. Photographs of Mike and Amanda entering restaurants together during times when he'd claimed to be in client meetings. Credit card charges that contradicted his reported schedule. Text message patterns that revealed constant communication disguised as professional correspondence. Each piece of documentation built toward a comprehensive picture of a man who had been systematically lying to his wife while conducting an increasingly serious affair with his assistant. But the most significant discovery came not from my own investigation, but from an unexpected source. Sarah Kim, my closest friend and fellow business owner, called me on a Thursday evening with information that would prove crucial to understanding the true scope of what Mike and Amanda had been hiding. "I wasn't sure whether to tell you this," Sarah began, her voice carrying the careful tone that indicated she was about to share something potentially devastating. "But I think you need to know what I overheard at the yoga conference last weekend." Sarah had attended a wellness industry conference in Seattle, the kind of professional gathering where Portland's alternative health community networked and shared business strategies. During a break between sessions, she'd been in the restroom when two women entered and began discussing what they clearly believed was private information. They were talking about a marriage counselor in Portland who was treating a couple with some kind of family secret, Sarah continued. Something about discovering that two people who thought they were in love were actually related. The counselor was asking other professionals for advice about ethical obligations when clients don't know they're committing incest. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah continued talking, but I could barely process her words through the roaring in my ears. The conversation she'd overheard suggested that Mike and Amanda had progressed far enough in their relationship to seek couples counseling, and that their counselor had discovered something about their family connection that they themselves didn't know. "Did they mention any names?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded distant even to myself. "No names," Sarah replied, "but they mentioned that the couple worked together at a marketing firm, and that the woman was much younger than the man. I wouldn't have thought about it, except that one of them mentioned the man's father had a history of abandoning families and starting new ones." The description matched Mike and Amanda's situation with devastating accuracy. If the conversation Sarah had overheard was about them, it meant that their affair had progressed to the point where they were seeking professional help to manage their relationship. More importantly, it meant that a trained counselor had discovered family connections that suggested Mike and Amanda were related in ways that would make their relationship not just morally questionable, but legally problematic. I thanked Sarah for the information and ended the call, then sat in my kitchen processing the implications of what I'd learned. If Mike and Amanda were indeed related through his father Thomas Coleman, their relationship constituted not just adultery but incest. The revelation would destroy not only their affair, but potentially their careers, their social standing, and their psychological well-being. The woman who had spent months carefully documenting evidence of her husband's infidelity now realized she was dealing with something much more complex and devastating than a simple workplace romance. The investigation I'd begun to save my marriage had uncovered a situation that would require an entirely different kind of response, one that would test every ethical boundary I'd ever established for myself. As I sat in the home that Mike and I had built together, surrounded by the accumulated memories of what had once been a happy partnership, I felt the final transformation taking place. The trusting wife who had spent weeks hoping to understand and repair her marriage was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness and too dangerous for simple confrontation. Mike and Amanda thought they were conducting a secret affair that would lead to their happiness at my expense. They had no idea that their relationship was built on a foundation that would destroy them both, and that the woman they had dismissed as a naive obstacle to their future was about to orchestrate their complete downfall. Marcus Thompson's preliminary report arrived via encrypted email on a gray November morning that matched my increasingly somber mood. The private investigator had worked with remarkable efficiency, utilizing resources that ranged from public records searches to discreet inquiries within Portland's interconnected business community. What he'd uncovered about Amanda Reed's background was far more complex and disturbing than I'd anticipated, though it confirmed my growing suspicions about the true nature of her relationship with Mike. Amanda Reed wasn't just Mike's assistant, she was a woman with a carefully constructed identity that obscured her real family history. According to Marcus's research, she'd been born Amanda Coleman in Salem, Oregon, 28 years ago. Her mother, Carol Reed, had reverted to her maiden name after what appeared to be a bitter separation from Thomas Coleman when Amanda was 3 years old. The timeline aligned perfectly with Mike's memories of his father leaving their family to start a new life in Salem. The documentation was thorough and devastating. Birth certificates, school records, and employment history all pointed to the same conclusion. Amanda Reed was actually Amanda Coleman, Mike's half-sister. Their shared father, Thomas Coleman, had apparently managed to keep his two families completely separate for over 2 decades, leaving both his children ignorant of each other's existence until fate and workplace proximity had brought them together at Northwest Marketing Solutions. Marcus's report included photocopies of documents that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning multiple generations. Thomas Coleman hadn't simply abandoned Mike's family, he'd been maintaining dual households for years before finally choosing Carol Reed and their daughter over Mike and his mother. The man who Mike remembered as an absent father had actually been present and engaged, just not with the family that included Mike. More disturbing were the financial records that showed Thomas Coleman had provided substantial support for Amanda's education and early career development. While Mike had worked his way through college and built his professional reputation through determination and talent alone, Amanda had benefited from private school education, college tuition payments, and even what appeared to be startup funding for various business ventures that had ultimately led to her position at Northwest Marketing Solutions. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Mike had been attracted to Amanda partly because of her sophistication and professional competence, qualities that had been cultivated through advantages provided by the same father who had denied Mike similar support. Their affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was the culmination of their father's favoritism playing out in the most psychologically devastating way possible. But Marcus's investigation had revealed something even more sinister. Amanda's employment at Northwest Marketing Solutions hadn't been the result of responding to a job posting or networking within the industry. She'd specifically targeted the company after learning that Mike worked there, using connections and resources that suggested considerable advance planning. Her initial contact with the company had come through a staffing agency that specialized in placing executive assistants, but her request to be assigned specifically to the sales department where Mike worked indicated that their meeting had been orchestrated rather than accidental. The staffing agency records, which Marcus had accessed through professional contacts in the employment industry, showed that Amanda had turned down several other opportunities, while waiting for an opening that would place her in direct proximity to Mike. She'd invested months in positioning herself to enter his professional life, suggesting that her attraction to him was complicated by knowledge of their family connection that Mike didn't possess. I found myself reading the report multiple times, trying to process the implications of what Marcus had discovered. Amanda hadn't simply fallen in love with a married man, she'd systematically pursued a relationship with her half-brother while keeping their shared parentage secret. The level of psychological manipulation required for such a campaign suggested either profound emotional damage or calculated maliciousness that went beyond simple romantic obsession. Armed with this information, I realized that confronting Mike and Amanda directly would be insufficient to address the true scope of their betrayal. They weren't just having an affair, they were engaged in behavior that would horrify them once they understood their actual relationship. The revelation needed to be managed carefully, not just to protect my own interests, but to ensure that the psychological damage they would inevitably suffer was proportionate to the pain they had caused. David Chen, Northwest Marketing Solutions financial controller, had always struck me as someone who valued precision and ethical behavior above office politics and personal relationships. During the few conversations we'd shared at company functions, he'd impressed me with his analytical approach to complex problems and his apparent immunity to the kind of workplace drama that often complicated business operations. I arranged to meet David at a neutral location, a small restaurant in southeast Portland that was far enough from the business district to ensure privacy while remaining professional enough for a serious conversation. David's agreement to meet with me suggested that he was already aware of issues involving Mike and Amanda that warranted discussion with concerned parties. "I appreciate you making time for this," I said once we'd ordered coffee and settled into a corner booth that provided adequate privacy for sensitive conversation. David's expression was carefully neutral, but his willingness to meet indicated that he understood the seriousness of whatever I wanted to discuss. "Patricia mentioned that you might have concerns about some workplace dynamics," David replied, his tone diplomatic but engaged. The fact that he'd spoken with the CEO about my request for a meeting suggested that Mike and Amanda's relationship had become enough of a concern within the company to warrant executive attention. I decided to approach the conversation strategically, sharing information that would establish my credibility while gauging David's knowledge of the situation. "I've become aware that Mike and Amanda's professional relationship may have evolved beyond appropriate workplace boundaries," I said, watching his expression for signs of surprise or confirmation. David's slight nod indicated that my observation wasn't news to him. "Workplace relationships can create complications," he agreed carefully, "especially when they involve employees at different levels of responsibility and authority." The diplomatic phrasing confirmed that David was aware of the affair while remaining professionally cautious about discussing personnel matters with someone outside the company. I decided to share information that would demonstrate the seriousness of the situation without immediately revealing the full scope of what I'd discovered. "I have reason to believe that their relationship involves deception that could expose the company to significant legal and professional risks," I continued, pulling out a folder containing copies of some of Marcus's findings. "Information that suggests Amanda's employment here wasn't the result of standard hiring practices." David's expression shifted to more serious attention as I showed him documentation of Amanda's targeted approach to securing her position at Northwest Marketing Solutions. The evidence of her deliberate manipulation of the hiring process was enough to concern any financial officer, particularly when combined with the obvious personal relationship that had developed between her and Mike. "This suggests potential fraud in the hiring process," David said after reviewing the documents. "If she misrepresented her motivations for seeking employment here, it could invalidate her employment contract and create liability issues for the company." I nodded, pleased that David was focusing on the professional implications rather than the personal drama. "There are additional factors that make the situation even more complex," I said, preparing to share information that would ensure his complete cooperation with whatever strategy I decided to implement. Over the next hour, I provided David with carefully selected portions of Marcus's investigation, focusing on the aspects that would most concern him as a financial officer and company stakeholder. The evidence of Amanda's systematic deception, combined with Mike's apparent complicity in workplace misconduct, painted a picture of employees who had compromised their professional integrity for personal gain. David's analytical mind immediately grasped the potential consequences for Northwest Marketing Solutions. "If this becomes public, it could damage our reputation with clients who value ethical business practices," he said, making notes in a leather portfolio. "And if they've been using company resources to facilitate their personal relationship, there could be financial irregularities that need investigation." I'm hoping we can address the situation in a way that protects the company while ensuring appropriate consequences for the people responsible, I said, beginning to outline the framework of what would become my comprehensive strategy for handling the crisis. David's cooperation was crucial, not just because of his position within the company, but because his reputation for ethical behavior would lend credibility to whatever actions needed to be taken. Over the following weeks, he agreed to conduct a discreet internal audit of Mike and Amanda's use of company resources, looking for evidence of personal expenses charged to business accounts or company time used for non-professional activities. The audit results were even more damaging than I'd expected. Mike had been using his corporate credit card for restaurant meals that clearly weren't business-related, including charges at romantic venues during times when he'd claimed to be in client meetings. Amanda had been accessing company databases to gather information about employees and clients that wasn't related to her assigned duties, suggesting she'd been using her position to gather intelligence that could be valuable for personal purposes. Most significantly, David discovered that Amanda had been copying client contact information and marketing strategies to a personal email account, creating the foundation for potential competition with Northwest Marketing Solutions if she and Mike decided to start their own business. The systematic nature of the data theft suggested long-term planning that went beyond workplace romance into potential corporate espionage. Armed with this evidence, I realized that Mike and Amanda's betrayal of our marriage was part of a larger pattern of ethical violations that could result in criminal charges as well as civil liability. They weren't just having an affair, they were engaged in behavior that could destroy their careers and potentially result in prosecution for theft of corporate assets. Linda Martinez had built her reputation as one of Portland's most effective family law attorneys, through a combination of strategic thinking and ruthless execution that made her particularly suited for complex divorce cases involving significant assets and complicated personal dynamics. When I called her office to request a consultation, her assistant immediately scheduled an appointment that suggested Linda understood the urgency of my situation. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided," Linda said during our first meeting in her downtown office, overlooking the Willamette River. "This case involves factors that go beyond typical marital dissolution into areas that could require coordination with criminal attorneys and corporate law specialists." Linda's assessment confirmed my growing understanding that Mike and Amanda's affair was only one component of a much larger legal situation that would require comprehensive strategy to address effectively. The evidence of corporate misconduct, combined with the family relationship that neither of them apparently understood, created a complex web of potential legal consequences that would need careful management. My primary goal is protecting my financial interests and ensuring that Mike faces appropriate consequences for his behavior, I explained, outlining my priorities for the divorce proceedings. But I also want to ensure that the full scope of their deception becomes public in a way that prevents them from continuing to harm other people. Linda's approach was methodical and thorough. She began by reviewing all the evidence I'd gathered, from the private investigator's report to David Chen's financial audit, creating a comprehensive picture of the case that would support multiple legal strategies simultaneously. Her experience with high-conflict divorces had taught her to anticipate every possible response from opposing parties and prepare countermeasures that would maintain her client's advantages throughout the proceedings. "The family relationship between your husband and his assistant creates unique opportunities," Linda observed, after reviewing Marcus's findings. "Oregon law has specific provisions regarding marriages entered into through fraud or deception, and if your husband was aware of the relationship when he began the affair, we can argue that his behavior constitutes a form of fraud against you as well." The legal strategy Linda developed was elegant in its complexity. She would file divorce papers that initially focused on traditional issues like adultery and financial misconduct, allowing Mike and Amanda to believe they were dealing with a routine marital dissolution. Meanwhile, she would coordinate with David Chen to ensure that the corporate misconduct investigation proceeded on a parallel track, creating multiple sources of pressure that would prevent them from developing coherent defense strategies. Most importantly, Linda would time the revelation of Mike and Amanda's family relationship to maximize its psychological and legal impact. Rather than exposing their incestuous affair immediately, she would allow them to continue believing their secret was safe, while building a comprehensive case that would make their eventual downfall more complete and public. The divorce papers were filed on a Tuesday morning in December, delivered to Mike at his office by a professional process server, who ensured that the documents would be witnessed by his colleagues and superiors. Linda had deliberately chosen timing that would maximize the workplace impact, knowing that Mike's professional reputation would be damaged by the public nature of the proceedings. Mike's reaction that evening was a masterclass in defensive manipulation. He arrived home with the divorce papers clutched in his hand, his face a mixture of shock and calculated outrage that suggested he'd spent the afternoon preparing his response with considerable care. "How could you do this without talking to me first?" he demanded, waving the legal documents as if they represented some kind of betrayal, rather than a response to his months of systematic deception. "We could have worked through our problems without involving lawyers and making this public." I maintained the performance Linda and I had rehearsed, playing the role of the heartbroken wife, who had been driven to desperate measures by her husband's obvious affair. "I know about Amanda," I said, allowing tears to well in my eyes, while carefully avoiding any mention of the more complex information I possessed. "I can't pretend anymore that our marriage means anything to you." Mike's response confirmed that he and Amanda had prepared for the possibility that their affair would be discovered, but that they'd underestimated both the scope of my knowledge and the consequences they would face. His attempts to minimize their relationship as just a workplace friendship that got complicated were delivered with the kind of practiced sincerity that suggested he'd been rehearsing explanations for weeks. "She means nothing to me," Mike insisted, sitting beside me on our living room couch, with the same gentle pressure he'd once used for genuine comfort. "It was just a stupid mistake, a moment of weakness that got out of hand. We can fix this if you'll just give me another chance." The performance was almost convincing, but I'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated Mike was lying. The slight pause before he spoke, the way his eyes focused on a point just over my shoulder rather than meeting my gaze directly, the practiced rhythm of his words that suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous emotion. "I need time to think," I replied, maintaining the facade of vulnerability while internally cataloging every aspect of his deception for future use. "Maybe we should consider separation while we figure out how to move forward." Mike's relief was palpable, though he tried to hide it behind expressions of concern for my emotional well-being. The suggestion of separation rather than immediate divorce gave him hope that he could maintain both relationships while working to convince me to forgive his mistake. He had no idea that the separation would provide him with the freedom to spend more time with Amanda, while Linda and I gathered additional evidence that would ensure his complete destruction. Over the following weeks, Mike moved into a downtown apartment that Amanda had helped him find, though he maintained the pretense that their relationship remained purely professional. His daily phone calls to check on my emotional state were carefully scripted performances designed to maintain the possibility of reconciliation while giving him cover to pursue his affair more openly. Meanwhile, Linda was coordinating with David Chen to ensure that the corporate investigation proceeded according to our timeline. The financial audit had revealed enough misconduct to justify formal disciplinary proceedings, but David agreed to delay any action until Linda was ready to reveal the full scope of Mike and Amanda's deception. The most satisfying aspect of this period was watching Mike and Amanda's relationship evolve under what they believed was reduced pressure. With the separation providing cover for them to spend more time together, their affair intensified into something that resembled a genuine romantic relationship. Mike began taking Amanda to social events, introducing her to friends as his close colleague, and apparently making plans for a future that included public acknowledgement of their partnership. Amanda, meanwhile, seemed to flourish under Mike's increased attention and the belief that she had successfully competed with his wife for his affections. Her behavior at work became more confident and proprietary, as if she considered herself Mike's partner in both personal and professional contexts. Several Northwest Marketing Solutions employees reported to David that Amanda had begun making decisions that exceeded her authority and referring to future plans that assumed her permanent integration into the company's leadership structure. The irony was exquisite. The very success of their affair was creating the evidence that would ultimately destroy them both. Every romantic dinner, every weekend getaway, every public appearance together was being documented and would eventually serve as proof of their relationship when the time came to reveal its true nature. But perhaps most importantly, their growing confidence in their ability to manage the situation was making them careless about maintaining the professional boundaries that had initially concealed their affair. David's sources within the company reported increasingly bold displays of affection, private meetings that clearly weren't work-related, and conversations that suggested they were making long-term plans that included leaving Northwest Marketing Solutions to start their own business. The evidence file continued to grow, but now it included documentation not just of adultery and corporate misconduct, but of a relationship that both participants clearly considered to be the foundation for their future happiness. When the time came to reveal that their love affair was actually an incestuous relationship between half-siblings, the psychological devastation would be proportionate to the joy they had found in betraying their respective obligations. As winter settled over Portland and the divorce proceedings moved through their preliminary stages, I found myself in the unusual position of hoping that Mike and Amanda's relationship would continue to deepen and become more public. Every day that passed without them discovering their true connection was another day of evidence accumulation and another step toward ensuring that their eventual downfall would be complete and irreversible. The woman who had begun this journey as a heartbroken wife seeking to understand her husband's betrayal had evolved into someone capable of orchestrating a complex legal and personal strategy that would result in justice for multiple forms of deception. Mike and Amanda thought they had successfully managed the transition from secret affair to open relationship, but they had no idea that their happiness was being carefully documented as evidence for the reckoning that would soon destroy everything they thought they had built together. The Valentine's Day incident crystallized everything that had been building toward inevitable confrontation. Mike and Amanda had chosen to celebrate their first official Valentine's Day together at Canlis, Seattle's most exclusive restaurant, apparently believing that celebrating their love in another city would provide sufficient privacy from Portland's interconnected social circles. What they hadn't anticipated was that Canlis was also the preferred venue for celebrating milestone anniversaries among Oregon's business elite, including Patricia Williams and her husband, who were marking their 25th wedding anniversary. Patricia's call came the morning after their romantic getaway, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that she was about to share information that would have significant personal and professional consequences. "Jessica, I think we need to discuss what I witnessed last evening in Seattle," she said, requesting a meeting that suggested the situation had evolved beyond workplace gossip into something that required immediate executive attention. "We met at a coffee shop in Northwest Portland, far enough from the business district to ensure privacy while remaining accessible for Patricia's packed schedule." Her expression was troubled in ways that went beyond typical concerns about employee conduct, suggesting that what she'd observed had implications that extended far beyond simple workplace romance. "I saw Mike and Amanda at Canlis last night," Patricia began without preamble, clearly having decided that directness was the most appropriate approach for such a delicate conversation. "Their behavior was far beyond what anyone could consider professional colleagues celebrating a successful project. They were acting like deeply committed romantic partners, completely absorbed in each other to the exclusion of everyone else in the restaurant." Patricia's description of their evening painted a picture of two people who believed they had successfully navigated the transition from secret affair to legitimate relationship. Mike had apparently spared no expense in creating a romantic experience, complete with premium wine selections, special menu arrangements, and the kind of intimate conversation that suggested they were making significant plans for their shared future. "What concerned me most," Patricia continued, "was overhearing part of their conversation about leaving Northwest Marketing Solutions to start their own firm. They were discussing client lists, pricing strategies, and market positioning in ways that suggested they'd been planning this transition for months. If they're using confidential company information to build a competing business, we're looking at potential legal action that could affect everyone at the firm." The revelation that Mike and Amanda were planning to leave Northwest Marketing Solutions with stolen client information added another layer of corporate misconduct to their already extensive list of ethical violations. David Chen's financial audit had uncovered evidence of resource misuse and data theft, but their Valentine's Day conversation suggested a level of premeditation that could elevate their actions from workplace misconduct to criminal conspiracy. Patricia's position as CEO required her to protect the company's interests above personal relationships, but her obvious concern for my situation suggested that she understood the human cost of Mike and Amanda's deception. "I wanted you to hear this from me rather than through office gossip," she said, her tone softening slightly. "And I wanted you to know that the company will support whatever legal action you decide to pursue, both for the divorce proceedings and for any corporate misconduct issues." Armed with Patricia's first-hand account of their Valentine's Day celebration, Linda Martinez and I refined our strategy for the final phase of our comprehensive response to Mike and Amanda's betrayal. The evidence file had grown to include documentation of adultery, corporate theft, fraud in the hiring process, and systematic deception spanning nearly a year. But the most devastating weapon in our arsenal remained the family secret that neither Mike nor Amanda suspected. Marcus Thompson's continued investigation had uncovered additional details about Thomas Coleman's dual family arrangement that made Mike and Amanda's relationship even more disturbing than initially apparent. Thomas hadn't simply abandoned Mike's family for another woman. He'd been maintaining parallel relationships for years, systematically lying to both families about his commitments and responsibilities. The psychological damage from discovering that their passionate love affair was actually an incestuous relationship would be compounded by learning that their father had orchestrated circumstances that made such a meeting possible. The pressure campaign Linda and I implemented was designed to create multiple simultaneous crises that would prevent Mike and Amanda from developing coherent responses to any single issue. While they celebrated what they believed was the beginning of their legitimate relationship, we were systematically dismantling every aspect of their personal and professional lives. David Chen initiated formal disciplinary proceedings at Northwest Marketing Solutions, citing evidence of resource misuse, unauthorized data access, and breach of confidentiality agreements. The corporate investigation was conducted with the kind of methodical precision that left no room for denial or excuses, creating an official record of misconduct that would follow both Mike and Amanda throughout their professional careers. Simultaneously, Linda escalated the divorce proceedings by introducing evidence of financial fraud and systematic deception that painted Mike's behavior as calculated betrayal rather than momentary weakness. The legal filings included detailed documentation of his lies about meeting locations, his use of marital assets to fund his affair, and his deliberate concealment of significant financial information during the separation negotiations. Most importantly, we began the process of preparing for the revelation that would destroy their relationship completely. Linda coordinated with a genetics expert who could explain the implications of their family connection in terms that would be clear to both legal authorities and the general public. The DNA evidence that Marcus had obtained through careful investigation would be presented in a way that left no room for doubt about their biological relationship. The first cracks in Mike and Amanda's confidence appeared when David Chen called them into separate meetings to discuss the disciplinary investigation. Mike's initial response was predictable outrage combined with attempts to minimize the significance of his actions, but Amanda's reaction revealed something more complex and potentially more dangerous. According to David's report, Amanda had seemed almost relieved when confronted with evidence of her misconduct, as if she'd been expecting such a confrontation for months. Her responses to questions about her background and motivations were evasive in ways that suggested she was hiding information that went beyond simple workplace romance. Most intriguingly, when asked directly about her family history and her reasons for seeking employment at Northwest Marketing Solutions, she'd requested time to consult with an attorney before providing complete answers. Amanda's legal consultation suggested that she might know more about her family connection to Mike than she'd previously revealed, raising the possibility that her pursuit of their relationship had been even more calculated and malicious than I'd initially believed. If she'd been aware of their shared parentage while allowing Mike to remain ignorant, her behavior constituted not just incest but a form of psychological manipulation that bordered on criminal fraud. The investigation into Amanda's true motivations led Linda to recommend bringing criminal attorneys into our legal team, expanding our strategy beyond civil divorce proceedings into potential prosecution for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The complexity of the case was growing beyond anything I'd initially envisioned, but the scope of Mike and Amanda's deception seemed to require a response that addressed every aspect of their systematic betrayal. Meanwhile, Mike's attempts to manage the various crises affecting his life were creating additional evidence of his fundamental dishonesty and manipulative character. His phone calls to me during this period were masterpieces of calculated emotional manipulation, designed to convince me that the corporate investigation was somehow my fault for creating workplace drama through the divorce proceedings. "You're destroying my career over a personal issue that should have stayed between us," Mike accused during one particularly heated conversation, apparently believing that guilt and responsibility might succeed where charm and false remorse had failed. "Amanda's being punished for something that was entirely my decision, and she doesn't deserve to have her professional reputation destroyed because of our marriage problems." The protective tone Mike used when discussing Amanda's situation revealed the depth of his emotional investment in their relationship, but it also demonstrated his continued inability to take responsibility for the consequences of his own actions. Even when facing potential termination and criminal charges, he was more concerned about Amanda's welfare than about the damage he'd caused to our marriage or his professional obligations. Amanda's response to the mounting pressure was more strategic and ultimately more revealing. Rather than attempting to maintain her position at Northwest Marketing Solutions, she submitted her resignation with minimal explanation, apparently hoping to remove herself from the corporate investigation before additional evidence could be uncovered. Her resignation letter was professionally appropriate but completely lacking in the kind of detailed explanations that innocent employees typically provide when leaving under controversial circumstances. More significantly, Amanda immediately began seeking employment with companies that competed directly with Northwest Marketing Solutions, suggesting that she and Mike were accelerating their plans to exploit the confidential information they'd stolen. David Chen's investigation had revealed that Amanda had downloaded extensive client databases and marketing strategies to personal storage devices, creating a comprehensive toolkit for starting a competing business. The rush to capitalize on stolen information suggested that Mike and Amanda understood their situation at Northwest Marketing Solutions was becoming untenable, but their response demonstrated the kind of short-sighted thinking that had characterized their entire affair. Rather than attempting to minimize the damage from their misconduct, they were compounding their legal problems by actively using confidential information for personal gain. Linda's strategy for managing the escalating situation was to allow Mike and Amanda to continue making choices that would increase their legal exposure while preparing for the revelation that would make all their other problems secondary to the psychological devastation of discovering their true relationship. The longer they continued believing they were dealing with routine workplace drama and divorce proceedings, the more evidence they would create of behavior that would seem even more disturbing once their family connection was revealed. The breaking point came in early March when Mike and Amanda made the decision that would prove to be their final strategic error. Believing that they had successfully weathered the worst consequences of their affair being discovered, they decided to move in together and make their relationship completely public. Mike's lease on his downtown apartment was approaching renewal, and rather than maintaining the pretense of separation, he chose to move directly into Amanda's Northwest 23rd Avenue apartment. The decision to cohabitate was accompanied by increasingly bold public displays of their relationship, including social media posts that celebrated their partnership and professional announcements about their plans to start a consulting firm specializing in marketing strategies for regional businesses. They were effectively advertising their transition from secret affair to legitimate business and romantic partnership, apparently believing that public acknowledgement would provide protection from further scrutiny. Linda and I watched their public celebration of their relationship with the satisfaction of generals observing enemy forces moving into position for decisive defeat. Every social media post, every professional announcement, every public appearance together was creating additional evidence that would make the eventual revelation of their incestuous relationship more devastating and more legally significant. The comprehensive nature of their public relationship also meant that the psychological damage from discovering their family connection would be witnessed by their entire social and professional network. Rather than dealing with private shame and personal reckoning, Mike and Amanda would face public humiliation that would follow them throughout their careers and personal lives. But perhaps most importantly, their decision to start a business together using stolen client information was creating criminal liability that would ensure legal consequences regardless of how they responded to learning about their biological relationship. Even if they somehow managed to psychologically survive the revelation that they were half-siblings, they would still face prosecution for corporate theft and conspiracy. The final phase of our strategy began with Linda scheduling a mediation session designed to resolve the remaining issues in our divorce proceedings. Mike had been requesting such a meeting for weeks, apparently believing that face-to-face negotiation would allow him to convince me to accept a settlement that would protect his financial interests and professional reputation. His confidence in his persuasive abilities was touching in its naivety, given the comprehensive evidence file that Linda had assembled. The mediation was scheduled for a conference room in Linda's downtown office building, with a professional mediator who specialized in high-conflict divorce cases involving significant assets and complex personal issues. Mike arrived with his attorney Robert Hayes, apparently expecting a routine negotiation session that would allow him to minimize the financial and reputational damage from our divorce. Amanda accompanied Mike to the mediation, ostensibly as emotional support, but clearly also as a statement about their committed relationship. Her presence at what should have been a private family matter demonstrated either remarkable insensitivity or calculated provocation, though I suspected it was primarily evidence of her complete confidence in their ability to control the situation. The mediation began with routine discussions of asset division and support arrangements, allowing Mike and his attorney to present their version of events and their proposed settlement terms. Mike's narrative portrayed our marriage as a relationship that had naturally evolved beyond romantic partnership, with his affair being an unfortunate but understandable response to our emotional distance rather than calculated betrayal. Amanda's presence during these discussions was particularly surreal, as she sat beside the man who was describing the dissolution of his marriage as if she were a neutral observer rather than the primary cause of the marital breakdown. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I occasionally caught glimpses of satisfaction that suggested she was enjoying the process of watching Mike formalize his rejection of our shared life. Linda allowed the initial discussions to proceed according to Mike's preferred narrative, letting him and his attorney present their case with confidence while she documented every statement that would later be contradicted by the evidence we'd gathered. The psychological impact of our revelations would be enhanced by first allowing Mike and Amanda to fully commit to their version of events. When Linda finally began presenting our evidence, the transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The financial documentation showing Mike's systematic deception, the corporate investigation results detailing Amanda's misconduct, and the private investigator's findings about Amanda's targeted employment all combined to paint a picture of calculated betrayal that went far beyond simple marital infidelity. Mike's attorney quickly realized that his client had provided incomplete and misleading information about the scope of the situation, while Mike himself seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of evidence that had been gathered about his activities. But Amanda's reaction was more complex and ultimately more revealing, as her professional composure cracked to reveal something that looked almost like panic. The detailed documentation of her background research on Mike, her manipulation of the hiring process, and her systematic theft of confidential information suggested premeditation that went beyond workplace romance, into territory that might require criminal prosecution. But her visible distress when confronted with evidence of her family history suggested that she might have been aware of complications that she'd hoped would remain hidden. Linda's presentation built methodically toward the revelation that would destroy everything Mike and Amanda thought they knew about their relationship. The genetic evidence was presented with clinical precision, supported by documentary proof of their shared parentage and expert analysis that left no room for doubt about their biological connection. The moment when Mike and Amanda understood that their passionate love affair was actually an incestuous relationship between half-siblings was everything I had hoped it would be, and more devastating than I had imagined possible. Mike's initial reaction was complete denial, followed by desperate attempts to dispute the evidence, and finally by a kind of psychological collapse that was painful to witness despite everything he had done to deserve such consequences. Amanda's response was more complex and ultimately more disturbing. Rather than sharing Mike's shock and horror, she seemed to experience something closer to resignation, as if the revelation confirmed suspicions she'd been harboring but hoping to avoid confronting. Her lack of surprise suggested that she might have known about their family connection throughout their relationship, making her behavior not just incestuous but a form of calculated psychological manipulation that bordered on criminal fraud. The mediation session ended with Mike's complete emotional breakdown and Amanda's quiet departure from the building, leaving behind the wreckage of what they had believed was their perfect love story. The legal proceedings that followed were almost anticlimactic compared to the psychological devastation of their discovery, though the criminal charges for corporate theft and fraud ensured that their legal problems would continue for years. Mike's attempts to salvage his professional reputation were unsuccessful, as news of the incestuous affair spread throughout Portland's business community with the kind of speed that gossip achieves when it involves prominent people in shocking circumstances. Amanda's departure from the city was swift and permanent, though criminal charges followed her to whatever new location she chose for attempting to rebuild her life. The divorce settlement that Linda negotiated on my behalf was comprehensive and favorable, reflecting both the strength of our evidence and Mike's complete lack of leverage given the circumstances of our marriage's dissolution. More importantly, the legal precedent established by our case created protection for other spouses who might face similar combinations of adultery and financial fraud. 6 months after the revelation that destroyed Mike and Amanda's relationship, I found myself sitting in the garden behind our Hawthorne home, surrounded by the late summer abundance of vegetables and flowers that I'd planted during the darkest period of discovering my husband's betrayal. The garden had become a metaphor for the process of rebuilding my life from the foundation up, creating something beautiful and nourishing from ground that had been left fallow by years of neglect. The psychological journey from betrayed wife to strategic architect of justice had transformed me in ways that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of my marriage's dissolution. The woman who had once trusted completely and questioned nothing had evolved into someone who understood that love without wisdom was merely vulnerability, and that justice sometimes required patience and precision rather than immediate confrontation. My businesses had thrived during the months when I was orchestrating Mike and Amanda's downfall, partly because the analytical skills required for comprehensive strategic planning had sharpened my ability to solve complex problems for my clients. Zen Flow Studio had expanded to include workshops on resilience and personal empowerment, while my marketing consultancy had attracted new clients who valued the kind of thorough preparation and strategic thinking that had characterized my approach to ending my marriage. The financial settlement from the divorce had provided security and independence that allowed me to make choices based on personal fulfillment rather than economic necessity. More importantly, the experience of successfully navigating such a complex crisis had given me confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise in my future. Portland's business community had ultimately rallied around me with support that reflected both sympathy for what I'd endured and admiration for how I'd handled the situation. The story of Mike and Amanda's downfall had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of ethical violations, while my role in exposing their misconduct had established my reputation as someone who combined strategic thinking with principled action. The house on Hawthorne had been completely renovated during the months following the divorce, transformed from a space that held memories of failed partnership into an environment that reflected my individual taste and priorities. The home office where I'd first discovered evidence of Mike's deception had become a bright, efficient workspace that supported both my consulting practice and my writing projects, documenting the experience of strategic recovery from betrayal. Most importantly, the process of rebuilding my life had attracted new relationships that were based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect rather than the kind of romantic idealization that had characterized my marriage to Mike. The men I'd begun dating understood that they were interacting with someone who had been tested by significant challenges and had emerged stronger and wiser rather than damaged or bitter. The legal and professional consequences for Mike and Amanda had continued to unfold long after their initial downfall, creating a comprehensive illustration of how systematic deception ultimately destroys everything it touches. Mike's criminal conviction for corporate theft had resulted in both financial penalties and professional sanctions that effectively ended his career in marketing, while Amanda's prosecution for fraud had included charges related to her deception about family relationships that carried additional psychological evaluation requirements. Their story had become a case study in business schools and legal programs, illustrating the interconnected nature of personal and professional ethics and the comprehensive consequences that result when people choose systematic deception over honest communication. The documentation of their downfall had provided valuable insights for other professionals dealing with workplace relationships and family businesses managing succession issues. But perhaps most satisfying was learning that Mike and Amanda had never recovered from the psychological trauma of discovering their biological relationship, with both requiring extensive therapy and counseling to process the implications of their inadvertent incest. The love they had celebrated as transcendent and transformative had become a source of shame and horror that would influence their emotional development for the rest of their lives. The DNA evidence that had destroyed their relationship had also revealed additional information about Thomas Coleman's pattern of abandoning families and creating circumstances that led to psychological damage for his children. The investigation had uncovered at least 2 other families that had been affected by his deception, leading to a broader understanding of how systematic parental irresponsibility creates cascading consequences across multiple generations. As I reflected on the complete arc of my journey from discovery to resolution, I realized that the most important transformation had been learning to trust my own judgment and analytical abilities rather than deferring to other people's interpretations of complex situations. The woman who had initially doubted her own perceptions when confronted with evidence of her husband's affair had evolved into someone who could orchestrate comprehensive strategic responses to complex challenges.
Garden, where I spent my summer evenings, had become a symbol of growth that emerges from systematic cultivation rather than natural accident. Each plant had been chosen deliberately, positioned strategically, and nurtured consistently to create an environment that supported both beauty and productivity. The process required patience, planning, and persistent attention to detail, but the results justified the investment in ways that random growth never could. My new life had been constructed with the same methodical attention to foundation and structure that had characterized my approach to ending my marriage, but with the joy and optimism that comes from building something authentic rather than dismantling something false. The skills I'd developed during the months of investigation and strategic planning had become permanent additions to my personal toolkit, available for whatever challenges or opportunities might arise in my continuing journey. The story of Mike and Amanda's downfall had become a source of empowerment for other women facing similar betrayals, demonstrating that victims of systematic deception could choose to become strategic architects of justice rather than passive recipients of other people's choices. The comprehensive nature of their consequences had provided a template for others seeking to ensure that betrayal resulted in appropriate accountability rather than mere inconvenience. The morning sun filtered through the renovated windows of my Hawthorne home as I prepared for what would be one of the most significant meetings of my transformed life. 18 months had passed since the mediation session that had destroyed Mike and Amanda's world, and the ripple effects of their downfall continued to create opportunities that I could never have imagined during the darkest days of discovering their betrayal. The call had come from Rebecca Martinez, a documentary filmmaker whose work on corporate corruption had earned national recognition and multiple awards. She was interested in creating a comprehensive film about my case, not just as entertainment but as an educational tool for business schools and legal programs studying the intersection of personal ethics and professional responsibility. "Your story represents something unprecedented in legal history," Rebecca had explained during our initial phone conversation. "The combination of adultery, incest, corporate theft, and systematic deception creates a case study that addresses multiple areas of law and psychology simultaneously. More importantly, your strategic response demonstrates how victims of complex betrayal can choose empowerment over victimization." The documentary project represented more than professional recognition. It was an opportunity to ensure that the lessons learned from Mike and Amanda's destruction could benefit others facing similar challenges. The comprehensive documentation I had maintained throughout the investigation would provide source material for a film that could serve as both cautionary tale and empowerment guide. As I dressed for the meeting with Rebecca's production team, I reflected on how completely my life had been reconstructed since the revelation that had ended my marriage. The woman looking back at me from the bathroom mirror bore little resemblance to the trusting wife who had once brought homemade lunches to her cheating husband's office. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the confidence and purposefulness of my new life had certainly improved my appearance. The change was fundamental, affecting every aspect of how I approached relationships, business decisions, and personal challenges. The financial independence secured through the divorce settlement had provided the foundation for choices that would have been impossible during my marriage. Zen Flow Studio had expanded into a comprehensive wellness center offering not just yoga classes but workshops on resilience, strategic thinking, and personal empowerment. The marketing consultancy had evolved into a specialized firm helping other women entrepreneurs build businesses that couldn't be compromised by personal relationships gone wrong. Most significantly, I had begun writing a book documenting the complete process of strategic recovery from systematic betrayal. The manuscript, tentatively titled The Architecture of Justice, was attracting interest from publishers who recognized the market for practical guidance that went beyond simple self-help platitudes to provide concrete strategies for complex problem-solving. Rebecca's production team arrived at exactly the appointed time, their professional equipment and careful preparation reflecting the serious nature of their documentary work. The initial interview session was scheduled to last several hours, covering everything from my early suspicions about Mike's behavior to the final legal proceedings that had resulted in comprehensive consequences for both him and Amanda. "We want to understand not just what happened but how you developed the strategic thinking that allowed you to orchestrate such a comprehensive response," Rebecca explained as her crew set up cameras and lighting equipment in my living room. Most people facing similar betrayals either react emotionally or retreat into denial. Your approach was methodical and ultimately devastating for the people who had tried to destroy your life. The interview process was both therapeutic and educational, requiring me to articulate the decision-making framework that had guided my actions throughout the investigation and legal proceedings. Rebecca's questions were penetrating and thoughtful, designed to extract insights that would be valuable for audiences dealing with their own complex challenges. The key insight, I explained during one particularly important segment, was recognizing that Mike and Amanda's betrayal wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was systematic and calculated, which meant that my response needed to be equally strategic. Emotional reactions might have provided temporary satisfaction, but they wouldn't have addressed the full scope of their deception or prevented them from hurting other people in the future. The documentary crew was particularly interested in the investigation process, from hiring Marcus Thompson to coordinating with David Chen's corporate audit. The systematic approach to evidence gathering had created a comprehensive case file that supported multiple legal strategies simultaneously, ensuring that Mike and Amanda couldn't escape consequences by focusing on any single aspect of their misconduct. The private investigator's report was crucial not just because it revealed Amanda's true identity, but because it demonstrated the premeditated nature of her pursuit of Mike. I continued reviewing the documentation that had been so carefully assembled. When we could prove that she had specifically targeted him for employment at Northwest Marketing Solutions, their relationship moved from workplace romance into the category of systematic fraud. Rebecca's team spent considerable time documenting the corporate investigation that David Chen had conducted, interviewing him about the financial irregularities and policy violations that had provided grounds for criminal prosecution. David's analytical approach to the evidence had been essential for establishing the professional misconduct that had accompanied the personal betrayal. The most important lesson for other business owners, David explained during his interview segment, is that personal relationships in the workplace create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people with malicious intentions. Jessica's case demonstrates why companies need comprehensive policies and monitoring systems that can detect misconduct before it causes significant damage. The documentary also included interviews with Linda Martinez, whose legal strategy had been crucial for maximizing the consequences of Mike and Amanda's deception. Linda's approach had been to address every aspect of their misconduct simultaneously, preventing them from minimizing any single issue by claiming it was isolated or unintentional. The key to comprehensive justice in cases like this, Linda explained to the camera, is understanding that systematic deception creates multiple legal vulnerabilities that can be addressed through coordinated strategies. Jessica's case involved family law, corporate law, and criminal law, which required careful timing and extensive preparation to execute effectively. The most emotionally challenging aspect of the documentary process was discussing the psychological impact of discovering that Mike and Amanda's affair was actually an incestuous relationship between half-siblings. The DNA evidence that had destroyed their relationship remained the most shocking element of the story, but it was also the revelation that had ensured their psychological suffering would be proportionate to the damage they had caused. Learning that their passionate love affair was actually incest created a level of psychological trauma that therapy and counseling can address but probably never completely heal. I explained, reviewing the expert testimony that had been part of the legal proceedings. The irony is that their father's abandonment and deception had created the circumstances that made their meeting possible, which means their relationship was the culmination of multiple generations of family dysfunction. Rebecca's research had uncovered additional information about Thomas Coleman's pattern of abandoning families and creating psychological damage for his children. The documentary would include interviews with other family members who had been affected by his systematic deception, creating a broader context for understanding how parental irresponsibility creates cascading consequences across multiple generations. The production process extended over several weeks, with multiple interview sessions and extensive review of the documentary evidence that had been crucial for the legal case. Rebecca's team was thorough and respectful, understanding that they were dealing with material that had destroyed lives and created lasting trauma for everyone involved. The most satisfying aspect of participating in the documentary was the opportunity to demonstrate that victims of systematic betrayal could choose strategic empowerment over emotional reaction. The comprehensive nature of Mike and Amanda's downfall had been the result of careful planning and methodical execution rather than luck or circumstance. The message I hope people take from this story, I said during the final interview session, is that betrayal doesn't have to define you as a victim. It can become the catalyst for discovering strengths and capabilities that you didn't know you possessed. The process of seeking justice taught me more about my own character and potential than decades of comfortable marriage ever could have. The documentary was scheduled for release through multiple platforms, with educational licensing that would make it available for business schools, legal programs, and counseling training courses. The comprehensive nature of the case made it valuable for multiple academic disciplines, while the human story would ensure broad public interest. Meanwhile, the book project had attracted the attention of a major publisher, whose editors understood the market potential for practical guidance on strategic problem solving. The manuscript had evolved beyond simple memoir into a comprehensive guide for people facing complex personal and professional challenges that required systematic responses. The architecture of justice would include detailed worksheets and decision-making frameworks that readers could adapt to their own situations, along with case studies from other people who had successfully navigated similar challenges. The goal was to provide practical tools rather than inspirational platitudes, giving readers concrete strategies for developing their own comprehensive responses to systematic deception. The book's publication was coordinated with the documentary release, creating a multimedia approach to sharing the lessons learned from Mike and Amanda's destruction. Speaking engagements at universities, business conferences, and legal seminars provided additional opportunities to reach audiences who could benefit from understanding the strategic approach to complex problem solving. The transformation of my professional life had been accompanied by equally significant changes in my personal relationships and living environment. The Hawthorne house had been completely renovated to reflect my individual taste and priorities, with particular attention to creating spaces that supported both solitude and entertaining. The home office where I had first discovered evidence of Mike's deception had become a bright, efficient workspace that supported my writing and consulting projects. The room now contained awards and recognition from various professional organizations, along with photographs from speaking engagements and business achievements that documented my post-divorce success. The garden had become a particular source of pride and satisfaction, with carefully planned landscaping that provided both beauty and practical benefits. The vegetables and herbs I grew supplied my kitchen with fresh ingredients, while the flowers created an environment that supported meditation and creative thinking. The garden represented the kind of systematic cultivation that had characterized my approach to rebuilding every aspect of my life. The dating process had been approached with the same strategic thinking that had guided my response to marital betrayal, though with considerably more joy and optimism. The men I chose to spend time with understood that they were interacting with someone who had been tested by significant challenges and had emerged stronger rather than damaged. The relationship that had developed with James Crawford, a fellow business owner whose own divorce had taught him the value of honest communication and mutual respect, represented the kind of partnership that was possible when both people brought wisdom and experience to their connection. Our relationship was built on compatibility and shared values rather than romantic idealization or emotional dependency. James owned a sustainable building company that specialized in environmentally responsible renovation projects, and his work on my house had provided the foundation for a personal connection that had evolved naturally over many months. His appreciation for my strategic approach to problem solving complemented my admiration for his craftsmanship and ethical business practices. "What I find most attractive about you," James had said during one of our early conversations about serious commitment, "is your ability to make decisions based on wisdom rather than fear or wishful thinking. Your experience with Mike and Amanda taught you things about human nature and strategic planning that most people never learn, and those insights make you a much more interesting and reliable partner." The relationship with James had developed according to principles I had learned during the process of ending my marriage: complete honesty about past experiences, careful attention to patterns of behavior rather than promises or declarations, and systematic evaluation of compatibility in areas that would affect long-term success. The process was more methodical than romantic courtship typically involves, but the results were more sustainable and satisfying. The legal aftermath of Mike and Amanda's downfall had continued to unfold with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The criminal prosecution for corporate theft had resulted in significant financial penalties and professional sanctions that had effectively ended both their careers in marketing and business consulting. Mike's attempts to rebuild his professional reputation had been unsuccessful, partly because the story of his incestuous affair had spread throughout Oregon's business community, and partly because his systematic deception had demonstrated character flaws that made him unsuitable for positions requiring trust and responsibility. His current employment was in retail sales at a furniture store in suburban Portland, a dramatic decline from his previous executive position. Amanda had fled Oregon entirely, relocating to a small town in rural Montana where her background was unknown and her previous misconduct couldn't affect her employment prospects. However, the criminal charges had followed her across state lines, and her conviction for fraud and corporate theft had created a permanent record that would affect her opportunities throughout her life. The psychological trauma of discovering their biological relationship had required extensive therapy and counseling for both Mike and Amanda, with ongoing treatment that would likely continue for years. The expert witnesses who had testified during the legal proceedings had explained that the combination of shame, horror, and identity confusion created by inadvertent incest could result in permanent psychological damage that would affect their ability to form healthy relationships in the future. Most significantly, their story had become a cautionary tale within Portland's business community about the comprehensive consequences of systematic deception and ethical violations. Companies throughout the region had implemented new policies and monitoring systems designed to prevent similar situations, while professional associations had developed educational programs that used their case as an example of how personal misconduct could destroy entire careers. The broader impact of exposing their relationship had extended beyond legal and professional consequences to create awareness about family secrets and parental irresponsibility that could have devastating effects across multiple generations. The investigation had uncovered Thomas Coleman's pattern of abandoning families and creating circumstances that led to psychological damage for his children, leading to discussions about accountability for parents whose deception creates lasting harm. Social services agencies had used the case to develop new protocols for investigating family situations where parental deception might be creating risks for children, while counseling organizations had created training programs to help therapists recognize and address the psychological effects of discovering family secrets that affect identity and relationships. The documentary's educational impact had been enhanced by companion materials that Linda Martinez and I had developed for law schools and business programs, providing detailed analysis of the legal strategies and decision-making processes that had been crucial for achieving comprehensive justice. The materials included mock trial exercises and case study discussions that helped students understand how personal and professional ethics interact in complex real-world situations. The speaking engagements that had resulted from the publicity surrounding the case had provided opportunities to reach audiences throughout the country, sharing insights about strategic thinking and empowerment that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of marital betrayal. Universities, business conferences, and professional associations had requested presentations that addressed everything from corporate ethics to personal resilience. The most important message I tried to convey, I explained during a keynote presentation at a women's business conference in San Francisco, is that challenges and betrayals don't have to define you as a victim. They can become opportunities to discover capabilities and strengths that comfortable circumstances never reveal. The process of seeking comprehensive justice taught me more about strategic thinking and personal empowerment than decades of successful marriage and business operations ever could have. The audience responses to these presentations consistently demonstrated hunger for practical guidance about navigating complex personal and professional challenges. The questions from participants revealed that many people were dealing with situations involving systematic deception, ethical violations, and relationship betrayals that required more sophisticated responses than simple emotional reactions or legal consultation could provide. The success of the speaking engagements had led to development of workshops and seminars that provided intensive training in strategic thinking and comprehensive problem solving. The programs were designed for business professionals, legal practitioners, and individuals dealing with complex personal challenges that required systematic approaches rather than impulsive responses. The workshop curriculum included modules on investigation techniques, evidence documentation, legal strategy development, and psychological preparation for extended conflict resolution. Participants learned to approach complex challenges with the same methodical planning that had been crucial for achieving justice in my own situation. The financial success of these various projects had provided security and independence that allowed for choices based on personal fulfillment rather than economic necessity. The consulting practice, book royalties, speaking fees, and workshop income had created multiple revenue streams that supported the lifestyle I had designed during the process of rebuilding my life after divorce. More importantly, the professional recognition had established my reputation as someone who combined strategic thinking with principled action, attracting clients and opportunities that aligned with my values and expertise. The work had become a source of personal satisfaction that went far beyond financial benefits to provide meaning and purpose that had been missing from my previous life. The house on Hawthorne had been paid off entirely through the divorce settlement and subsequent business success, providing the kind of financial security that eliminated anxiety about housing costs and allowed for renovation projects that reflected my individual taste and priorities. The property had become a sanctuary that supported both solitude and entertaining, with spaces designed for writing, consulting, and the kind of meaningful conversations that had become central to my social life. The garden continued to provide both practical benefits and symbolic satisfaction, with seasonal plantings that reflected the cycles of growth, harvest, and renewal that had characterized my personal journey. The process of planting, and nurturing the garden had become a form of meditation that supported the continued development of patience, persistence, and strategic thinking. The relationship with James had evolved into the kind of partnership that was possible when both people brought wisdom and experience to their connection rather than neediness or unrealistic expectations. Our discussions about potential marriage were based on practical considerations about compatibility, shared goals, and mutual support rather than romantic idealization or social pressure. What I appreciate most about our relationship, I had told James during a recent conversation about our future, is that we both understand the difference between love based on wisdom and love based on wishful thinking. Your experience with divorce taught you the same lessons about honest communication and realistic expectations that I learned from dealing with Mike's systematic deception. The potential for marriage with James represented the possibility of partnership that enhanced rather than compromised individual identity and achievement. The relationship was built on mutual respect for each other's capabilities and independence rather than emotional dependency or traditional role expectations. The legal precedent established by my case had been cited in subsequent divorce proceedings throughout Oregon and surrounding states, providing protection for other spouses facing similar combinations of adultery and financial fraud. Linda Martinez had become a recognized expert in complex divorce cases involving systematic deception, with speaking engagements and consultation requests that drew on the strategies developed for my situation. The criminal prosecution of Mike and Amanda had also established important precedents for corporate misconduct cases involving personal relationships that affect professional responsibilities. The systematic documentation of their policy violations and theft had provided a template for other companies dealing with similar situations. As I reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred since the morning I first discovered Mike's suspicious text messages, I realized that the most important change had been learning to trust my own judgment and analytical capabilities rather than deferring to other people's interpretations of complex situations. The woman who had initially doubted her perceptions when confronted with evidence of betrayal had evolved into someone who could orchestrate comprehensive strategic responses to any challenge. The garden where I spent my evening hours had become a symbol of growth that emerges from systematic cultivation rather than natural accident. Each plant had been chosen deliberately, positioned strategically, and nurtured consistently to create an environment that supported both beauty and productivity. The process required patience, planning, and persistent attention to detail, but the results justified the investment in ways that random growth never could. The documentary's release had been accompanied by media coverage that had brought national attention to the case, with interviews on news programs and podcasts that had reached audiences throughout the country. The story had resonated with people dealing with their own complex challenges, generating thousands of emails and social media messages from individuals seeking guidance about their own situations. The response had been so overwhelming that I had hired additional staff to manage the correspondence and consultation requests that had resulted from the publicity. The demand for strategic guidance about complex personal and professional challenges had revealed a significant market for the kind of comprehensive approach that had been crucial for my own success. The book had become a bestseller within its category, with translation rights sold to publishers in multiple countries who recognized the universal applicability of strategic thinking principles. The international success had led to speaking opportunities throughout Europe and Asia, sharing insights about empowerment and justice with audiences whose cultural backgrounds provided different perspectives on the same fundamental principles. The ultimate satisfaction, however, came not from professional success or financial security, but from the knowledge that Mike and Amanda's systematic betrayal had ultimately served to reveal capabilities and strengths that comfortable circumstances had never required. The process of seeking comprehensive justice had been transformative in ways that went far beyond the specific goal of ending my marriage and ensuring appropriate consequences for their misconduct. The woman I had become through the process of strategic empowerment was more interesting, more capable, and more fulfilled than the trusting wife who had once defined her identity through her relationship with a man who had been systematically deceiving her. The betrayal that had initially seemed like the destruction of my life had actually been the catalyst for discovering who I really was and what I was capable of achieving when challenged by circumstances that required wisdom, patience, and strategic thinking. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.